Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another installment of the Media Ecology Seminar here in Second Life. My name is Kenny Hubble, Ken Hudson in real life, and I'd like to welcome everyone tonight who's come out in person, and those of us who'll be joining the live stream via slcn.tv. It's been a real experience to welcome some distinguished guests into Second Life over the last few weeks and have them have the opportunity to not only discuss their first impressions of this 3D virtual world, this immersive environment, this multi-user virtual environment, however you want to call it, but also for them to interact with some of the people gathered here in Second Life and give those people, you the audience, a chance to ask your questions. So we'll certainly proceed in that manner again tonight. And again, we have a wonderfully distinguished guest in the personages of Paul Levinson Freenode and the person of Paul Levinson. Welcome, Paul.
I'm very happy to be here, Ken, and I see a lot of friends out there. It's good to see Wixley. And a couple of other good people, too. Actually, everyone out there was good, but I mentioned Wixley since he did a great interview with me a couple of years ago.
It's great. When we were preparing this event, we Facebooked back and forth a bit, and I noticed today you sent out a notice on Facebook, and right away there were a couple of avatars on that, which I just thought was great. And it just shows that we have with us not only a distinguished scholar and author, but also someone who's very involved in the contemporary social media scene.
Well, that's true. I try to do as much damage as possible, and using new media to talk to people is a great way of doing that.
Well, let me just give the people here who aren't familiar with your works or your accomplishments just a bit of background to give them a sense of who we have here tonight. And I'm just going to read here from this little blurb that you gave me. Paul has 8 nonfiction books, and we have many of the books up on the book table tonight, and I'm afraid they don't connect to Amazon or anything like that, so you have to search them on Amazon. Maybe for the next one we'll get some real links in there. But Paul has written 8 nonfiction books, including The Soft Edge, Digital McLuhan, which is where I was first introduced to his writing, Real Space and Cell Phone. And he's been the subject of major articles in the New York Times, Wired, the Christian Science Monitor, and his books have been translated into 9 languages. And he also appears as a commentator on The O'Reilly Factor, CBS News, Scarborough Country, and NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, Nightline, and numerous other national and international radio and television shows. He's also a fiction writer. And his novel, The Silk Code, won the Locus Award for the best first novel of 1999, and he has since published several other fiction works in the mystery and science fiction genre. To top it all off, Paul is a professor and chair of communication and media studies at Fordham University in New York. So a very warm welcome to Paul tonight, and thank you so much for joining us here in Second Life.
It's my pleasure. Let me mention, by the way, about Amazon. If anyone here wants to get any of my books on Amazon, you can email me at levinson.paul@gmail.com, and I'll give you an address that you could send it to, and it's one of my addresses. When I receive the book, I'll autograph it for you and send it back to you at no additional charge to you. So that's the least I can do since we don't have any Amazon links here.
And unfortunately, the book table isn't real.
Right.
Well, Paul, one of the reasons I invited you to participate in this is for your work in the field of media and communications. And obviously, as a chair of the Communication and Media Studies Department at Fordham, you've certainly done a lot of scholarly work. We now think of media and new media as a pervasive and immersive experience. Was it that way when you got interested, and what brought you into this field of study?
You know, I've been interested in the media, I think, ever since I was born, but I can't remember quite that far. But I do remember when I was in 4th grade, so who knows how old I was then, I don't know, 9 or 10 years old, I was having a conversation with someone that I started about a local newscaster here in New York. His name was Robert Trapp. about. In fact, he was on the air for decades. He died about 3 or 4 years ago. But he used to have an interesting smirk that he had when he delivered the news. And I remember talking to my friend way back then saying, isn't that interesting that here's this guy delivering serious news, but yet he has this smirk on his face. And that's probably the first time I can recall in which I was talking about the media. But everything about communication has always interested me. You know, in addition to writing, I'm a songwriter and I sing harmony. And ever since I can remember, I was always fascinated by how harmony itself works. I mean, the fact that you have one person singing a melody, you suddenly have an additional person, and it makes all the difference. And then when you have a third person, it's extraordinary. So I live and breathe the media and communication, and to me, they're almost a direct pipeline into everything that's significant in the cosmos.
That's a fascinating response. And of course, I couldn't help but be reminded of Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death" when you talked about this newscaster with the smirk. And of course, is it that you studied with Neil Postman at NYU?
Well, I often joke that Neil Postman was my greatest failure as a student, meaning when I tried to teach him to be more positive about the media. But yes, I did study with him. Neil, of course, started the media ecology program at New York University. And after I completed my MA in media studies at the New School for Social Research, I walked a couple of blocks down the street, and in fact was interviewed there by Neil and Chris Nystrom, and I knew immediately that I was interested in going into that program. And it made an enormous difference in my life because I had not written any books prior to then. And more than anything else what the PhD program did is give me a structure in which I could write Human Replay, a theory of the evolution of media. That was back in the late 1980s. And it was a very exciting program, a very exciting world. It's not much like that anymore. And, you know, I've always felt privileged to be part of that, you know, almost in the way that, you know, the apostles, you know, may have felt that way in the 1930s in Cambridge, you know, other great intellectual communities. You can always tell when you're part of a community like that, and it was very exciting and inspiring.
I remember also when I was a student reading Neil Postman's work, Amusing Ourselves to Death, and I was at the University of Toronto where there was a tremendous anti-McLuhan sort of sentiment, and in some quarters, especially in the literary quarters. And it was an accessible means to sort of go around the corner with them and still write about media in the context of literature, but without quoting the man himself. Now, speaking of the man himself, and we had Eric, of course, on a couple of weeks ago, Eric McLuhan, Marshall's son, but you actually had a meeting with Marshall McLuhan that was significant in your life. Is that right?
Well, more than one meeting with him. What happened is when I was in the PhD program, one day I walked into Neil Postman's office and he was seated behind his desk, and I can't use the avatar to sort of do the impersonation I would do if we were here in person.
With more practice, you could.
Pretty good, yeah. He was making one of these like sort of pseudo-pained faces, and he gave me a manuscript. It was a pretty short manuscript, not that many pages. And as soon as I looked at it, I saw the name H. Marshall McLuhan on the first page, and of course I knew it was Marshall McLuhan. And what it was a draft of an article about the laws of media, which Marshall and then later Eric joined him, but Marshall was working on back then. And I said to Neil, what's the problem? And Neil said, well, this is a great article, but I'm not quite getting a part of this. And I think Neil did get it, but he liked to sort of play those intellectual games, and maybe testing if I understood it. Anyway, to make a long story short, what came out of that meeting was Neil said to me, you know, if you understand this so well, because I quickly read the manuscript and told Neil what I thought McLuhan was trying to get out there. Neil said, if you think you understand, so why don't you write a little preface that you know that can help us as we prepare this article for publication in the scholarly journal, etc., which McLuhan frequently contributed to and which Neil Postman edited. So of course I did, because then, as now, I never ever turned down an invitation to write or speak or anything. I'd sooner miss dinner than turn down an invitation to do anything having to do with communication.
Well, and we appreciate that with gratitude tonight.
Well, yeah, but what I didn't know is when I gave Neil the preface that I wrote, he sent it up to McLuhan. And then Neil told me about that, and when I heard that McLuhan had been sent the preface, as egotistical as I am, I saw my future in media going down the drain, because I was thinking, imagine McLuhan is going to get this and think, who's this idiotic upstart Levinson daring to write a preface? But in any case, McLuhan called me, and he disagreed with a little of what I wrote, but he basically said he liked it. We got together when he came to New York a little later, and I got to say, I've known some impressive people in my life, but no one with the brilliance, with the sense of humor, just the sheer joy of intellectual discovery that McLuhan had. And let me add, about the opposition to McLuhan. I've given a lot of thought to that, over the years. It's really due to a combination of, I think, three things: laziness on the part of many people in the academic world, jealousy because they wish they had received the public attention that McLuhan received, and last and certainly not least, just sheer human stupidity. And you're not supposed to use that word about colleagues in the academic world, but that's the only word I can think that describes it. And fortunately, I think as time is going on, coming to appreciate the contribution that McLuhan made.
Well, it becomes a way of seeing the world, and I know that I've also been fortunate enough to have contact with many colleagues and students of McLuhan over the last few years, and the hardest part is getting past one's own way of perceiving the world through a bias, as it were, of one media or one sense, one way of appreciating, rather than understanding the tapestry, the mosaic of all of these media create within our lives.
Well, there's no doubt about it, and the number of people who look at individual media and even say something useful about them is legion. That's the easy part. What's not easy, what's difficult, and what makes all the difference are people who can look at the larger environment and see how things fit together. It's the difference between the microscope, which has its use, dissecting something and looking at the pieces of a very small part on the one hand, and the telescope on the other hand, looking at things in their cosmic perspective in the broadest possible sweep. And that's what McLuhan brought to the study of media.
Yes, and continues to bring to those of us who follow the lead in studying his works and understanding the challenge that is before us now, which is beginning to understand media that McLuhan never really considered. I'm not sure that there is even a reference to something like what we call Second Life today in the writings of McLuhan, although, of course, he foretold the Internet and the networking of us altogether. What do you think he would? How would he take it when if it was McLuhan sitting beside us here? What would he think of this environment?
He would be delighted, if he were here, because he would see that this was another expression of what he called the global village. After all, there are people listening to this, and I see sitting before me in their avatars from all over the world. And
yes,
they'll soon be asking questions. And this is essentially the interactive global village that McLuhan was talking about back in the 1960s, which of course didn't exist then. The village in the 60s wasn't global. At most it was maybe national. And it certainly wasn't the village. It wasn't interactive. people could all see the same thing, but there was no way they could interact with what they saw on the screen the way we're interacting here. So I think McLuhan, if he were seated right out there in that audience, next to some of these fine people, would be extremely comfortable. And I'm sure he would raise his hand at some point and say, "Oh, Paul, you don't understand much of what I'm saying at all. You're really too much of a logic boy." But that would be great.
Well, if I did most of the talking, undoubtedly he would raise his hand. I'm not so sure about you, Paul.
Well, McLuhan and I disagree on lots of things, and that's another thing that made such a pleasure to know. McLuhan was not about people who just, agreed with every single word that he said. He was about intellectual inquiry in the best possible sense.
Well, and the work that you wrote that preface for as a graduate student that ended up becoming the Laws of Media, of course, contains the tetratic formula for analyzing dynamic, complex systems in movement, like the fabric of our media environment today.
Absolutely. It is a template for understanding any kind of medium, and not only, again, as I was saying before, a particular medium, but the relationship of one medium or one technology to another. And apropos of what you were saying even before, virtual reality, Second Life, what we're doing right now is really a perfect example of what television has flipped into. But it's flipped into many things. It's flipped into this. It's flipped into YouTube. It's flipped into a completely, different kind of web than people even imagined 5 or 6 years ago. A web in which you have systems like Dig, in which people decide, what gets on the front page, unlike the New York Times, where you have a small group of editors. It's not all the news that's fit to print there. It's all the news that a tiny group of editors deem fit to print. Or something like Wikipedia, where you have the readers deciding what goes on there. All of these things could be explained by a tetra and would fit in with that principle of reversal or flipping into something when the medium gets to its limits.
Yes, it's fascinating to watch it. I think one of the most exciting, and I mean, we're in a very complex situation here. We're speaking through Skype. Where our avatars are represented in Second Life virtual form. We're streaming that feed then live onto the internet in a sort of television-style format. We're retrieving television, as it were, for the internet in this case tonight. And, of course, all of the other participants are watching us with varying degrees of interaction and participation. And so I know when I began to get interested in Second Life as an opportunity not only to share ideas and meet people, but to teach people and to really discover things about yourself, one of the things that excited me in my analysis of it was how many other forms it contains.
Well, absolutely. And, let me just say, in terms of what Second Life retrieves, clearly what it retrieves, as we can all see right here, is the Greek form, right? I mean, we could be sitting right here. Socrates might have been tried in an environment very similar to this, and of course, I hope nobody sentences me to any hemlock. But there really is something very nice and comforting, I think, about this kind of environment. Unlike a classroom, unlike all the more modern environments, and yet it's incredibly high tech, but it looks like something very ancient.
Yes, all of the forms, even our clothing, and most avatars are of human form. Of course, you could be any form. You could be an animal or switch genders and so on and so forth. But generally, it is the forms of real life that are retrieved into Second Life, and that's usually a very strong starting point for people getting into it. They start to explore who they are.
Yeah, and actually that's one of the principles of the theory of the evolution of media that I developed back in the late 1970s, what I call the anthropotropic development, anthropo-human tropic towards that media go through. And there is always a powerful appeal to the realistic, the naturalistic, because that's genetically what feels right to us. So unlike many critics of media, I think superficial critics who think that as media evolve, they're becoming more artificial, less natural. I might even point to Second Life and say, well, you know, you're spending your time in this virtual environment. What about the reality out there? But first of all, this is a natural environment. And secondly, Ken, as you just pointed out, what we learn from this environment, we bring to our real world outside this environment because we're learning more about ourselves and about our world.
Yes, the relationship between in education, the relationship between the avatar and the individual is aspirational and cyclical. That we invest, and I don't mean to sound like Dr. Freud here, but we invest a certain amount of energy in these characters, and those characters replay onto us our personalities. And I think anyone who's been in Second Life for any length of time will start to recognize the crossover between how you act in Second Life and how you act in real life, and it goes both ways.
Well, as a matter of fact, unexpectedly tomorrow I will be introducing Mike Wallace, a very famous CBS newscaster who will be talking for Fordham University. So we'll see what kind of how nice I am to Mike Wallace tomorrow, and whether the experience made me into a better professor.
We won't have luckily we don't have a morally safer avatar here or anything that we can get you riled up with. But we know one thing that you talked about was not only virtual worlds and but also all of the social media, the so-called social media, Dig, Facebook, MySpace. I'm a big Twitterer. I don't know if you're on Twitter, Paul. I think you are.
Oh yeah, I'm on Twitter. I'm on Pounce. You know, what's good about Twitter and Pounce? Pounce is P-O-W-N-C-E. They do pretty much the same thing, except on Pounce you can actually send videos and MP3s as well as text messages. But I love it. I mean, the fact that you can send out a quick note and let people know what you're doing, I think is great. By the way, I saw a bunch of hands raised out there. So are we going to call on them or?
They might be playing with the hands-up chair, but if anyone does have a question, you could just instant message me in World. That's the best way to get that across to me, and I'll certainly pass it along directly to Paul, and he'll be able to answer it in the space.
All right, good.
And feel free to do that at any time. We'll take various pauses throughout if anyone wants to ask a question. But you're very involved in social media as well. Now, you're an avid blogger. You're involved in several different websites, producing podcasts and so forth. How has this changed? And I guess you're not, like myself, you're not a digital native. This isn't your natural environment per se. You've acclimatized yourself to this emerging force in our culture. And how did that come about? What attracted you versus maybe some of your other colleagues who maybe stay more literate-centered? Not that you're not literate, I mean, but in a post-literate way, you're embracing these technologies that are emerging for a generation still to come.
Well, as I may have mentioned before, when we were talking about McLuhan, or I think actually you mentioned it, he was writing in the 1960s, but he was writing about something that was 30 years away from fruition. But you can actually see in his writing style that he had a digital mind. And the truth of the matter is, I've always been hankering for today's social media. One of the most frustrating things for me before there were digital media is, say I'm watching television. I have a thought about something I see in the show. So, okay, I can talk to my wife and kids about it. That's not frustrating. That's fun. But there's no way I can get those thoughts out to a larger world or hear and see what they might be saying. The very best I can do is wait a couple of days for a newspaper. I could write something up and wait even longer until it's published. Or if you think about the relationship of email to, old-fashioned mail, that used to drive me crazy. I'd want to give someone basically, here this is hostage to them. I have, by the way, we've had the worst mailmen in the world where we live. That's another story. They're always walking in the rain with the mail held out so it gets drenched. But anyhow, although things obviously don't always work perfectly by any means in the digital realm, I find these social media to be absolutely wonderful. I feel like I've been in a prison all of my life prior to this. And now, it's never been better. I see a show on television, I can do a blog about it. Just to give you an idea, one of the shows I've really enjoyed over the past few months has been Mad Men, a show about the advertising world in 1960 New York. So, apropos of what you can do through digital media, I had a blog piece. I reviewed it every week. One of the actors in that series, Rich Soma, emailed me at one point actually correcting a small mistake I made in the blog. That's great. It's good to have corrections. So we got in touch. I suggested to him, hey, why don't I interview you for my podcast, lightonlightthrough.com. He said, great. Within about a day or two, we did an interview. You can hear that interview up there on the podcast right now. The point being that the distance between imagination and the realization of that imagination has never been shorter. And for me, that is absolutely wonderful. It's intoxicating. The fact that you can think something, you can dream something, you can imagine something, and then all you have to do is sit down, often just at your computer, and then make that real, make that begin to happen, I think is spectacular.
And I agree with you completely. I grew up through the advent of black and white television to color television and that transitional phase in that generation. But I always felt like I was primed for something a bit more vigorous than 30 channels and the radio and reading a book at the same time. So I think it's something very interesting, that idea that through our needs, through our genuine desires, intellectual, creative, cultural desires, these networks have emerged. Would you say that would fit closely with your aforementioned theory, the anthrotropic?
Yes, it absolutely would. It's not an accident that these things are developing, and they're developing in a certain direction. Human beings crave this kind of social interaction. Everyone's mind, even the dullest people, their minds are bursting with ideas, and they love to be able to communicate them to other people, whatever they might be about. And our media are indeed slowly but surely becoming more consonant with those desires. Originally, in what I call the pre-technological state, or I sometimes refer to it not very imaginatively as stage A in technological evolution. But in that stage, much like the way we're sitting here now in this on this plaza or arena, we had full sensory interaction. We could see, hear, touch, but what we couldn't do is communicate beyond the boundaries. That's why we went down the path of inventing media in the first place. First writing, then photography, then telegraph, telephone. All of those media enabled us finally to get beyond our immediate physical surroundings. But we paid a price for them. The price we paid is that the media were very artificial. If you think about the telegraph, for example, the price we paid for the ability to instantly communicate from here to any place else in the world is we had to go out of our home, we had to go see a stranger, in some kind of office. We had to say our message. That's why most telegrams were very formal. If you wanted to say, hey, honey, I love you, you're not going to feel that comfortable reciting it to someone sitting behind, a desk. But that's the way the telegraph operated. And then on the other end, it had to be delivered. But I think that what we're seeing is slowly but surely we're maintaining those extensions beyond our sensory boundaries, but we are slowly retrieving these natural elements which are really in many ways the most enjoyable part of our lives.
Yes, that's fascinating what you say about the telegraph. And of course you would probably pay by the word or line, would it be?
That's absolutely right. So you had to be very, very succinct.
And so it really sort of boxed you in. There was no long sentimentality in any telegraph.
That's right. Although in a way, I mean, here's like a nice connection. You could say that, I just came up with this right here, you can say that the telegram medium was much like microblogging, right? Because microblogging deals in very short bursts also.
Yes, like Twitter retrieves the Marconi here.
Exactly. Twitter retrieves the, not Marconi, Morse.
Morse.
Morse, right.
And there are a couple of questions here, Paul, that I sort of bring in now. You were speaking about your postman and someone in the not being a very good deliverer and getting the mail wet, and someone in the audience wanted to make sure that your postman's name wasn't Neil.
No, Neil never got any mail wet. Thanks for the question. I was talking about my postman with a small P. I'm sure if Neil ever had any mail delivered, he would have taken the utmost care with it because he respected the printed word. On the other hand, if Neil had to deliver a television set, he probably would have dropped it out of the back of his car and left it on the street somewhere.
Now, there is also another question here. Now, this is from Worksley, who's in the audience here, and the question relates to an interview that you had with him in 1999, wondering if Second Life has changed the hierarchies between the pictographic and the alphabetic, I think, or alphacentric, he says here, alphacentric media. Has Second Life shifted these hierarchies?
Well, yes, I do think that in the earlier days of the web, and I can't remember exactly what I said in that excellent interview with Jeremy back then, but I know that I publicly admitted to being a textual chauvinist, and what I meant by that was certainly in the early days, anything that you could do with an image was usually just a pale, weak reflection or substitute for what you could do with the alphabet. And the alphabet still has an enormous amount of power. So I'm still to some extent a text chauvinist, but I do admit, and you have to be open to progress, that if you look at Second Life, we are now beginning to get things in this kind of visual environment which do go beyond anything you could do with the written word. And again, just looking out at this group here and the various avatars and people walking around and there's something very, very nice about it. It's a nice place to spend time, and I can't see anything purely alphabetic that could do something like this.
Yes, he was actually referring here, just to extend the question for Jeremy, thinking of Richard Bartle and his text-based virtual world. So now this being a image-based virtual world.
I think an image-based virtual world is much better than a text-based virtual world. No doubt about that.
Yes, and I mean, these environments, whether we're immersed literally in images as we are tonight, or simply moving between various states as we do in, let's say, a multi-dimensional platform like Facebook, Facebook is no less environmental than an experience in Second Life, but there is a warmth of the familiar, the warmth of the human, as it were, in a space like Second Life that creates an immediacy, I think, that is a breakthrough in terms of how we communicate.
Well, 100%. And here again, we can get back to McLuhan. One of the excellent points that McLuhan made was the alphabet separates us to some extent from our environment. We're clearly looking at something, and no matter how immersed we might be in a book that we're reading, it's not an environmental emergence. It's a much more intellectual immersion in that, and that's excellent. But but it's not what we have here. And I think that the word that you use, warmth, applies very well. There is a real warmth to this kind of environment in Second Life, which you don't have at all on Facebook. It's a completely different thing. Facebook feels to me more like a cafeteria, where there are a lot of different things where you can reach out and you'll pick up this and take a bite of this and have a sip of this and look at that, and that's great. But this feels much more like, I don't know, like literally being on an island somewhere, not in a cafeteria, and being on the inside looking out, not on the outside looking in.
Yes, there's a distancing with the 2D, although the 2D platform, of course, enables us to organize information in a way that this environment can be very difficult in doing. And many of the people that are involved in Second Life or virtual worlds are also involved in various degrees of social media. How do you think that a platform like Second Life or any of the virtual worlds that are emerging now will start to combine with some of the popular social media into a hybrid form in the near future?
Oh, I think that's fairly clear, at least to me, and for all I know, it's happening already. But I could imagine after our talk going someplace and sitting down in Second Life and watching a great movie, or going someplace else and from Second Life being in a room with 30 different screens, each of which has a different YouTube presentation, and that would be a lot of fun. The one thing which, however, I don't see happening, and I talk about this in one of my more recent books called Real Space, The Fate of Physical Presence in the Digital Age on and Off Planet. The one thing which seems to be resistant to any kind of digital transmission or virtual environment is food. Right? And so it would be very nice if we could all share, a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, a glass of wine, whatever. Now, each of us can individually. That's not hard. But there's no way that if you look at this book table here, if there were a pot of tea here on this table, and I would say, hey, let me pour you a cup of tea, we could go through it virtually, but we couldn't do it really. And the way I put it is, with all the advances that we've made with Java, we still can't send an actual cup of Java. And so there I think you run into an ultimate limitation of virtual reality. But that's good, and that also answers these dour critics who think that somehow, this whole virtual thing can take over our lives. No, there's no chance that that's going to happen, because no matter how nice this is, and it is nice, it cannot convey walking along a wind-swept beach, walking hand in hand with anyone that you care about on that beach, sitting in a nice restaurant, sipping a glass of wine or a glass of ginger ale, eating sushi, if you're like me and my wife, we love that. So, I mean, those are things that are a fundamental part of human life which go beyond the digital world. But when it comes to images, and when it comes to sounds, and when it comes to words, then I think we're going to see much more integration in places like Second Life, where everything ranging from movies to songs to books to really anything that you can get on an iPhone now, all of that will be here as well.
Yes, and much of it has already arrived, and you're exactly right. There are the food issue is one of the most primary social experiences and communal experiences that we would have as humans. And although you can have artificial food here or wear a coffee cup or a glass of champagne, I can tell you 100% I've drank a lot of virtual champagne, and none of it all added up together comes close to one good glass of real champagne.
Well, right, absolutely not. I mean, you can probably talk yourself a good case and sort of pretend you're getting drunk, but it's not the same.
It's true. But it does bridge many of those. It's interesting what you say, because if you searched for food, for example, in Second Life, you would find a myriad of choices to be able to purchase the image of food and display that on your table as part of perhaps creating the set. But it really is like a movie set. None of it's real in the sense of obviously you can't eat it.
That's right, and it's very interesting, to think, to show you how complex it is. If you think about something like pornography, which I force myself to think about every once in a while, it's a tough job, but somebody has to do it. If you think about, a picture of an attractive person, whoever you might find attractive, naked or whatever, there the image does have some real emotional impact. In other words, you can derive some sort of, obviously not as much pleasure as you would in an in-person situation, but it's still something that's pleasurable. But if you compare that to food, the most that the image of food has is maybe just a slight interest. It sort of looks aesthetically nice. But obviously it doesn't convey any of images and what they evoke in us. And sometimes the image can be, if not enough, certainly doing something that's effective, but other times the image is really very, very little and so thin as to almost have nothing in common with the original.
Yes, and truly in this case, the food in Second Life would be that experience. It's almost like we collect these items or images, or people make them and display them as a way of reminding ourselves to leave and go and eat.
Yeah, I don't need any reminder for that. So I'm always.
But in terms of the emotional quality of this experience, the reality of the emotions, and while certainly there are the experience of food and so forth, the biological needs in that department certainly aren't met in any way by the Second Life experience. The emotional and romantic needs of people and those social needs are met in a great measure here, because instead of a two-dimensional interface, you actually have a self-representation that you're working with.
Well, yeah, and of course this has a long history now in the digital age. I think it was the French and their Minitel system in the early to mid-1980s. That's a long way off, 25 years ago, who, and I guess it's apropos that it happened in France, discovered that people were falling in love or thinking they were falling in love and certainly having rich emotional experiences in those days just by sending what we would today say are, IMs or text messages. And yeah, obviously a place like Second Life where in addition to that you can have some imagery, would make that even more so. There's an element to this, and I'm sure I'm not the first person who's made this point. Do you know the very first episode of Star Trek, The Menagerie?
I do know it very well, yes.
Yeah, and so, in terms of not really knowing what people look like, everyone looks like their ideal. That adds an interesting element to this. And if you compare that to, say, just text romances, there you don't know what the person looks like, so you might imagine what the person looks like, assuming you don't know the person. But here, it goes beyond that. You don't know what the person looks like, but you do have an image that the person has chosen. So, for example, those of you who are looking at me, sad to say I have a little less hair than I gave myself. I mean, not that much less hair, but a little less hair. But I mean, so the fact is...
Me too.
So there we go, and that's fine. But I mean, that adds like an interesting, aspect to this reality fantasy interface.
Well, and there are two other cultural references that always come to mind for me in Second Life. You mentioned the Menagerie, and I think that's a great example. The other two are cinematic. The first one being the movie Brazil, and it was almost the first experience I had in Second Life when I flew. And I don't know if you've had a chance to fly yet, Paul. You can fly after, but that idea of the darkness of the contrast between the darkness of the real life in that film and the fantasy life. That contrast, I think, is starkly represented here in Second Life.
Yeah, but let me say, I saw someone was drinking green tea. Good for you. I love green tea. By the way, white tea is even better if you've never had it. White tea are the tips. They're made from the tips of the green tea, and it's absolutely superb. It doesn't have quite as much caffeine as green tea, but it really is outstanding. Anyway, yes, I did see the movie Brazil, and actually I did fly here, but that's because when I got here last week, I was trying to get from one place to another, and I don't know what I pressed, but before I knew it, I was flying somewhere. So I'm more like Mary Poppins than the people in Brazil.
Well, we need to get you some wings.
Okay.
The other film that always comes to mind is especially the end of the Wim Wenders film, Until the End of the World, where the device that William Hurtis created to capture the images for the blind, allow the blind to see, get taken over by people who are sighted, and they become addicted to their own dream imagery.
I haven't seen that movie, but it sounds really good, so I'll definitely check it out.
Definitely worth a check. But not to cast, of course, this in a negative light. I think, as McLuhan would point out, in any media environments, you get all expressions. There is no good or bad. There's everything.
Well, yeah, and that's why, the one thing, apropos what I was saying about pornography earlier, porn is fine, but, people becoming predators, obviously online isn't. And, that's one of the reasons why we shouldn't just fall into, this view that everything is a perfect world, online, and, we've left behind, all the evils of, the real world. Unfortunately, whatever's in the real world usually has, some kind of role online as well.
Well, that's exactly it. And of course, we're in a mature, adults-only 18-plus environment. And as I've explained it to many people in the past, everything that you can find on the Internet in 2D is in Second Life in 3D. And when they don't quite get that, I say, no, I mean, everything that you can find is here. And literally it is.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. I'll definitely come back again with this.
There's lots to. Once you get flying, you're never going to stop. And of course, teleporting, which has to, as a Star Trek fan, you have to, of course, enjoy that element of it. So now, for everybody else who's not a Star Trek fan, we'll get off the Star Trek talk. But I did want to get into as we're getting further along here tonight. I wanted to mention, Paul, that you also have written some fiction, and including some science fiction. And I wonder if you're familiar with Stevenson's novel Snow Crash, which many point to as the origin of an envisioning of this style of 3D interactive environment.
Yes, I'm very familiar with it. In fact, I know Ashley Grayson, who was the agent for that novel, very well. But let me just say, about teleporting, and I was going to say something about it anyway, but it connects to what you're saying. In the 50s, teleporting was one of the basic planks of science fiction, and there's probably no better teleportation novel than The Star Is My Destination by Alfred Bester, and of course he jaunts from one place to another. That's a form of teleportation, and obviously Star Trek picked that up. But interestingly, and for reasons that I'm not completely sure of, written science fiction by and large left that topic, and including me. And so, I have time travel and the plot to save Socrates, and I guess that's a form of teleportation, but it's not teleportation per se. I have faster, not faster than light, but, speed of light travel to Alpha Centauri, all kinds of strange effects happen there. So, I and other writers do all kinds of fun things in our science fiction.
We're getting a bit of breakup here with you, Paul. Just I don't know if everyone's experiencing that, but just a bit of breakup there on your voice. So I did miss your last remarks.
All right. Can you hear me now?
I hear you totally fine.
All right. So let me just repeat again in case they didn't go through. What I was saying is that I think it's interesting that teleportation, by and large, has not been a theme in written science fiction since the 1950s, and since The Star's My Destination with Alfred Bester and his jaunting. Of course, Star Trek picked it up, but I don't know why that is, and so it's therefore especially interesting to me that that there's teleportation as such a fundamental part of the experience here in Second Life. I've written in my own science fiction about time travel, about travel to Alpha Centauri at half speed of light, but now that I think of it, I've never actually written anything about teleportation.
Well, I guess it's not science fiction anymore, right? If we're doing it all day long.
You're doing it here in virtual reality. It would still be, a hell of a trick to actually teleport in physical reality. But actually, of all the things, I don't think that teleportation is as impossible as time travel, because at least with teleportation, there are no paradoxes that you would run into. In other words, if I could teleport now instantly to, say, somewhere in Australia where this TV thing is being done, that would be miraculous, but it wouldn't be paradoxical. On the other hand, if I traveled even a half an hour back in time, that would begin to twist us around into things that would just go totally contrary to what we fundamentally expect of life.
Well, do you think, in following some of the discussion we've had tonight about how the need for a technology emerges before the technology, the human need leads to the discovery of the technology, do you think with the platforms that we have, the internet, telephone, and so on and so forth, that maybe it's just not such a pressing need?
Well, that's a very good question. I think, though, in most cases, when media don't develop, it is because there's not that much of a pressing need. For example, the holography hasn't become all that popular because we don't really need the third dimension when we're looking at still images. We need the third dimension more with moving images. So there's still, the still photograph still does an enormous amount for us. But in terms of teleportation, I don't think it's that we couldn't put it to good use. I think it's just that we really don't even have the first clue about how we would do it technologically. If you think about science fiction horror movies like The Fly, what are we going to do? Break up our atoms and send them? The truth is, Star Trek never really explained how beaming works. So, I can't even think of step one that we've taken towards teleportation.
I think there was an experiment, and I'll have to look this up, but an experiment where a single photon was sent across the room.
Well, look, a single photon gets sent across the room without teleportation at the speed of light. Not much of an accomplishment.
Maybe I was reading Charlatan Science magazine there. Just a bad parlor trick, really.
Well, but that really gets at the essence of it. The point is light travels at the speed of light. Electricity travels at the speed of light. Digital communication at the speed of light. All that stuff. But the key then with teleportation is how do we get something which isn't light or isn't an energy form to travel at that speed? Or, to put it otherwise, how could we convert my body or your body or anyone else's body into a form that could be sent at that speed, and then, and this is what the rub always is, reconstituted back into our form without a fly being mixed into it.
That's right, exactly. Well, and so now we've sort of veered into science fiction, but I wondered what your thoughts were on Snow Crash in relation to this metaverse that we find ourselves in tonight.
Well, I think Snow Crash was, as you said, a good, first introduction to what life would be like with this kind of environment. However, I think that what we're doing right here now is something that really is very different than what happened in Snow Crash. And to some extent, the cyberpunk dyspeptic, dystopic view is something else, being the bubbly optimist that I am, that although I might have enjoyed did and did enjoy and do enjoy those things from the point of view of narrative excitement, didn't seem to me to be a good prediction of the future. I'm much more Asimovian, to hark back to a much earlier science fiction in terms of the futures that he wrote about.
Right, and I think that also, it's not by accident that Second Life resembles Stevenson's metaverse. In fact, the creators of Second Life essentially built the Second Life around that vision, but with a different intent, of course. And I think it is true that you find that the positive elements of the human spirit, our culture, our sense of community, our desire to share ideas and information, these things are what come to the fore when there's a new form of communication, not, as you say, this dystopian, dark reality.
Yes, that's completely true, and I very much like the way you put that, because I think that we, as a species, do have these cultural, intellectual desires, and we always want to bring them further along and into the fore. And there's never any shortage of people ready to jump into that as soon as the technology opens up. And I think what's going on here in Second Life is a crystal clear example of that.
Right, and people's desire and willingness and readiness for that style of experience because of the massive growth and interest and literally the hundreds of things that you could go ahead and do any day of the week here in Second Life that resemble this experience, having a conversation with people, meeting people from all over the world. We have a reporter here from the Second Life News Network in the audience, and she sent me an instant message here, Paul. And she says that the thing that amazes me about Second Life is that everyone is so accessible here. I'm a writer with SLN.com. Writing stories here is unbelievably easy and can all be done in my real-life office without leaving my desk. I've met some amazing people from all over the world. People are so approachable here, kind and generous with their time.
Well, right, because I think that everyone is happy to be here, and there is a magical quality to this place. And I saw this also, the very first time I got onto a social network by the name of Genie. And there was a science fiction community there in the late 1980s, early 1990s.
Right.
And what happens is people are just happy, to be in this place. It happens in physical environments too. We go up to Cape Cod every year, and whenever we get up there and we walk on the beach, the first day or evening, everyone just smiles at each other because we want to be there. But this place has that same feeling.
Yes, and of course customizable to any mood or state. I sort of move between beachfront and New York loft, depending on my headspace.
Stick with beachfronts.
I want to, just while we still have just a couple of more minutes here, but I do want to just ask the audience if there are any other questions for Paul Levinson. And while we're waiting for the audience to reply, Paul, if there was something else that you wanted to say, just as a parting shot, or maybe a reflection on this experience tonight.
Well, actually, I see in front of me the name Farley Scarborough, assuming that that's associated, who has something in his hand that's steaming. I'm assuming that's a steaming cup of tea or coffee. And apropos of what we were saying before about food, I can almost feel the warmth from that. So, I may have to reevaluate what I was saying, about food. It may well be that there is something of the visualization of certain food things that does come through visually, which really gets to another thing that what this is also amazingly good at is teaching. You're having fun while you're here, but you're learning things, as you said before, about yourself and about this environment.
Well, absolutely, and education is one of the most emerging fields here in virtual worlds. There are upwards of 200 individual colleges and universities who have campuses here. I was fortunate enough to speak at an educational conference here in Second Life in the spring. And so I think that as culture moves forward in these virtual worlds, you're going to see more and more experiences, and more experiences where individuals who are, let's say, in a rural location or not connected with an institution get to participate and have a singular experience, let's say, of a university lecture without having to really leave their house.
Yeah, and my wife and I founded an organization called Connected Education back in the mid-1980s, and we offered courses online. In those days, there were no images at all. It was just pure text at 300 baud or BPS, and people in those days used to say, well, maybe you should do video conferencing, and that was okay. But I got to say, this is in a way better than video conferencing because again, it just feels so nice, and I would be happy to give a lecture here anytime about anything.
Well, that's good to know. I'm sure you're going to be taken up on that offer. I think that in education, it really does have the opportunity, and it's exactly right what you say. Oh, why don't we really have video phones? Well, people don't want to talk on the phone and actually have you see what they look like most of the time. And there's a distancing quality about watching someone's image on a television screen, or even if that screen is a computer screen.
You're absolutely right, because what's going on there is you see a real image, but you can't touch it. You can't get really closer to it. Here, precisely because we're not seeing real images, we don't feel that need to get closer to it. This is fine as it is.
Yes, and also this experience allows us to have the social quality, which is so crucial for sound education. Just getting the material is one thing, but being in a classroom full of interested people is certainly another element that wasn't always brought to the distance learning environment.
That's absolutely right. And, what, of course, the original distance learning environment did have is everyone could be in their home. They could be in a bathrobe. They could be dressed like a complete slob, which is the way I'm usually dressed. Not as good as I'm dressed here, although this is by no means any great shakes. But you have all of that here. But in addition to that, this very nice pastel overlay.
Yes, and as you say, it's not an image of someone, it's a representation. And so you're involved not only in cognating the person, what they look like and so on, but I think there's an aesthetic appreciation of how a person has styled themselves, how the kind of self-fashioning, right? That someone is choosing this look over another look, so that it's not simply a two-dimensional appreciation of the image. It's you participate in interpreting the avatar in a way that makes us all art forms. There's a phrase to end with.
That's a good phrase, and I like what I see before me here. A very nice collection of human beings, a couple of aliens thrown in there. That's great.
Well, and not only can you have one identity, of course, you can move. It's flexible, so that on any day of the week here, and of course last week being Halloween, it was wonderful to walk around in Second Life and see the expression of people who maybe hadn't dressed up for Halloween in 10 years or something like that. So they're able to have that experience, and really the joy of expression, I think, comes through in our meetings with people, and it's maybe perhaps that cornerstone of the happiness that you referred to.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things I talked about in my Digital McLuhan book is what the digital enabling does is make it much easier for any kind of artistic impulse to get expression. In the world before there were digital media, you had to learn how to play an instrument. You had to have incredible talent as a painter in order to do anything nice visually. All these things took an enormous amount of work. There was a great distance between the impulse and the fulfillment of that impulse. And the fact that that distance is much shorter now, I think is a great leap forward for human beings.
I believe that's the case as well, and I come at it from what's the next leap forward, and as our ability to one thing that you would find in Second Life if you spend any time here is that time is compressed. You have many more meaningful experiences pressed into the same time span. And what is the social ramification of more meaningful experiences in the lives of these participants over, let's say, 3 or 4 years? What discovery does that lead to culturally and of course, even technologically?
Well, it'll be interesting to see. About relationships, what's nice is I've obviously given lectures, hundreds of lectures to people in person. I've given lectures over the radio and even, through various, broadcasts or whatever. But this, it has, this unique flavor. And therefore, I think all of us sort of know each other in a way which we wouldn't if we were doing this in any other kind of environment.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And having met many people in real life after I knew them in Second Life, there is a strong sense that there's nothing to know. You already know the person.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I mean, that was the case even in the text-only environments. But again, this one has the additional elements.
Precisely. Well, we're just about out of time now tonight, and I just wanted to thank once again our guest tonight, Paul Levinson, who's taken time out to join us in Second Life, not only to give us some thoughts on his impressions of the environment, but also to look forward and discuss what might come out of this, and also look back a bit and see where we've come. And I speak on behalf of us all tonight, to Paul, when I thank you for your participation. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I hope that we can do it again down the road.
Listen, I'll be happy to come back here anytime. I enjoyed this immensely. It was a great audience. And by the way, thank you everyone for these little text messages you're sending me. I've seen them all, and I appreciate them. And I enjoyed this. And I definitely hope we can do it again sometime.
Thank you so much. And I'll be milling about here. And Paul, if you would like to mill about, and we can have a little chat with the audience once we go off air. Those of you who are in the audience and you want to see this again, you can visit the Second Life Cable Network website at slcn.tv. Not only have they provided a stream of tonight's event live, but you can see an archived version of this entire talk sometime. Usually it's posted within the day. There are friends and once again, thank you to our friends at SLCN for bringing this event out to a wider audience. I'll ask you to visit kennyhubble.com to learn about any updates on upcoming media ecology seminars. And also, you can join our group here in Second Life, the Media Ecology Group, or you can join our Facebook group, Media Ecology in Facebook. And those are 3 really great ways to stay up to date. And I'll certainly be posting the next event when that's known to us. Thank you all for coming tonight. Have a lovely evening, and thank you again, Paul Levinson.
My pleasure. Good night.